Bond, who's Executive Director of Creative Waco, Megan Wells, Cultural Arts Division Manager, the Department of Economic Development, City of Austin, Jim Ritz, Vice President, President and CEO of the Austin Theater Alliance and Paramount Theater and State Theater. We have Mary Pageant, our parliamentarian, community arts advocate, John Smither from Huntsville. I think we have him on the call. Brendan Land, a CPA and a lawyer from Maxwell Locke and Ritter. And then I want to also recognize Randy Ham, and who comes to us as Executive Director of Odessa Arts. This is Andy's baby. So he and Chris are leading these conversations across the state. I wanted to acknowledge Randy and his leadership of these statewide conversations. We want you to know that today, only the part of our conversation where Shannon is doing an update, we're going to record that because there are many colleagues across the state that would like this update. Beyond that, we are not recording any part of this because these conversations, it's really important that we feel comfortable. We want to have this really become one of those moments where, if you think about the metaphor of a megaphone, rather than us talking to you, it's really us very deeply listening. And so for us, it's really important that this feel like a safe space and that you be able to say really pretty much whatever it is you want. And we will all respect that, that we're here having a conversation and trying to grapple with the topic. So the topic at hand today is really this idea and this concept around what does reopening mean? And as we are suffering through and getting through, living through COVID-19 and its pretty extreme impact on the arts, but really very specifically also the performing arts. And so what is it to have an opportunity to reopen, and when does one do that, and how, and all of those things. So that's our general topic, not knowing where exactly you all will go with that topic today. But as we head into that, I do want to introduce Shannon Gangerty. We are a 501c4 organization, so we absolutely work deeply with Ann and Shannon and the work that they do on behalf of all artists in our state, artist-sponsored projects and arts organizations. Shannon has nearly 2 decades of legislative experience as a committee director and legal counsel for some of the Texas legislature's most powerful lawmakers. She's has been and is an expert in terms of legislative counseling, advocacy analysis, grassroots coordination, and has a wide range of clients that are both corporate and nonprofit. So our work with her has been incredible. The respect that others hold for her, we can feel. So without further ado, Shannon, I'm going to throw this to you and to get us started with a little bit of an update.
Well, thank you, Cookie, for your kind words. I'm really excited to give you all an update today, but I will tell you that depending on the day and or the hour that we are talking, the update will change because things are evolving so quickly that it just depends on the day to what the latest is. So I will tell you, today's actually been a big day, so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But in terms of reopening, you probably have seen Governor Abbott's come out. He does a press conference every couple of days to keep everybody updated. And what he did was he created a phase 1 of reopening Texas. And in that phase, you probably saw he opened up restaurants, movie theaters, malls at 25% capacity. And then he quickly added to that phase 1, hair salons, nail salons, and those types of services. So he recently this week came out with what he is calling phase 2. And in phase 2, he took that first category and took them from 25% capacity to 50% capacity. And then he added different types of entities to the list of businesses that could be open, types of things that can now be open. Childcare can be open immediately. He allowed for sports camps or little leagues to start opening. He allowed for summer camps to open, including overnight camps. He has allowed for local ISDs to decide if they would like to open up for summer school. Bowling, bingo, skating, rinks, professional sports could start opening up without spectators. So he's really, I think he should start coming up with lists of things that are not opening up. He's really opened up, a wide gamut of types of facilities, keeping restaurants at 50% capacity. Patios are not limited to the same capacity. So that is where we are. And I would think there's two really important things to note. One, although he is opening up at this, he's got different dates for what types of entity you are on when you can open. He is still holding out in certain areas of the state. It shouldn't affect anyone on this call, but in certain areas, he specifically mentioned El Paso, Randall County, Potter County, Moore County, certain areas that are considered more hot spots are not able to open up at the same level. So he's taking a little bit of a regional approach depending on where the numbers are. Another thing that he talked about, they were delayed by 1 week, so we will see what happens, but they're delayed, but not substantially. The other thing that he's really focusing on is what he's calling hotspot areas. He mentioned, when I say he, Governor Abbott, in his press conference, really is talking about focusing on nursing homes, on jails, and on meat packing plants. That is where we're seeing a big spike in our numbers, and so that's where he's been focusing. And one of the reporters asked him a question in his last press conference, which was, if you start to see a resurgent, are we going to have to start closing back down? And I thought his response was really interesting. He said, if there is a resurgent, the first thing he's going to do is stop or limit elective surgeries in the hospitals. And the second thing he would do was implement a plan that he came out with about a month or two ago on how he would increase hospital capacity. So the philosophy, whether it's good or bad, the philosophy of the governor at this point is that the goal is to make sure that we have hospital capacity for anyone that needs it. So I thought that was insightful to know, even if the numbers start to go up, his next step would not be to start to retreat on the openings. Something that came up on another call and that we were hearing a lot from arts community is liability concern. If I open up, will I be liable? And I don't have a great answer for you, but what I can tell you is that the governor, lieutenant governor, the speaker, and the attorney general have all come out publicly stating that there needs to be liability protections. And the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker sent a letter, my dates are all mixing together, I think it was last week, to the federal government asking for Congress to provide protections from liabilities for businesses. And their position was that we believe there should be protections, but we think it needs to come from the federal level. And so that is in the works. There are discussions about it happening. I don't have solid information to point to you to say you're protected and here's the statute to look at, but that is in the works, and it is something that that the leaders of the state are supportive of. The other thing that came out today that I think is relevant, the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker came out with a letter asking state agencies to come up with a 5% reduction in their budgets for the current biennium. The current biennium started in September of 2019, and it runs for 2 years and ends in August 31st of 2021. And so what that means is we really have already gone through 9 months of the 24-month biennium. And so a 5% reduction is not necessarily 5% starting now, it's 5% for your entire 24-month budgets. There's a little bit confusion. The letter, the way it's written, is a little bit confusing. And are the agencies supposed to just take the reduction, or are they supposed to submit a plan to the Legislative Budget Board and the governor's office on how they would reduce their budgets? We're trying to figure that out. But something to note, I talked to the executive director, Gary Gibbs of Texas Commission on the Arts. He is still not sure if the answer to that question, he's supposed to take the reduction or come up with a plan to take the reduction, but there is a $5 million appropriation sitting at the Texas Commission on the Arts that is for a very specific area of the state for a performing arts center that money has not been spent. I bring that up because there's a $10 million appropriation that we were able to secure last session for cultural districts. And our hope is that we can protect that $10 million for the cultural districts by using the $5 million appropriation as part of, they wouldn't have to take the entire $5 million, but we could use the 5% reduction by taking a part of the $5 million appropriation. So we're working to hopefully protect appropriations for the cultural districts. To be continued, we will keep you updated, but that is something that just came out 2 hours ago, I think. So we're still trying to figure out what that's going to mean for the arts community. The last thing I will mention before turning it over for questions is that there is a lot of resources, I'm sure you all know, coming down from the federal government to the state. And through just the CARES Act, there's $16 billion coming in to both the state and county and city governments. 11.2 billion of that is specifically for the coronavirus relief fund. And if you're a city over 500,000 population, you got a direct appropriation. And if you're a city below the 500,000, you can apply for the leftover, which was $1.8 billion. And I bring that up because I know some of the cities that you all are in, there's concern that if we are having to spend money on hospitals and extra law enforcement and other things to combat coronavirus, that's going to eat into some of the city's budgets for other purposes. I was going to pull it up. I don't know, Anne, if you've got it in front of you on what Austin, I think they got $170 million of that pot. I don't think Waco qualified for the original allocation, but that they would be able to apply for the 1.8 billion. So there are resources available for the state and for the government. And I think just trying to piece that out right now and figure out what are the requirements, how can it be used, is there any way that we can maneuver anything that we're working on to be part of those conversations. A lot of those guidelines are still coming down from the federal government. And I'm sorry I'm going over a lot of information at the same time, but it's just something to note that there are resources, and I'll try to get those numbers before we get done with this conversation on what's actually gone to anyone on this call. But I think I'll end there. That was a lot of information. If anybody's got any questions, or if you want me to expand on anything I talked about, happy to do so.
I do see that we have Top Clark has his hand raised. Is that with a specific question for our lobbyist, Shannon, or was that a comment you'd like to make? You'll have to unmute yourself if you're acknowledged.
Yeah, my concern with opening up, particularly for performing musicians here in my area around Waco, Texas, Clinton County, and 70 miles within that area, is how are venue owners expected to enforce social distancing when there's being alcohol served? And, people like to have a good time when they're out, and that's understandable. That's what it's for. But my concern is venue owners. Certainly, certain venues have even closed down here during this COVID outbreak. But I'm concerned for the venue owners. How does the governors think that, and y'all think that venue owners are going to be able to stay open, and when they can only operate at 25% capacity, that won't even give them enough to survive, much less pay musicians to perform. That's it.
Thank you for that, Top. And I think actually some of these other questions that are popping up in here in the chat box can kind of speak to that as well. It's the question of guidance and where do we get guidance and how do we move forward. I'm seeing here a question about where can we get more information about the liabilities concerning running a youth camp, any guidance about theaters reopening. Shannon, do you have any insight? We know the governor did release some very basic guidelines in phase 2. We know that, for example, museums can't have, interactive exhibits where people are touching things, but do you know where the state stands or where the governor's office stands on where people should be turning to for the guidance as they consider the reopening process?
Sure. There's a report online. I can actually try, if I can figure it out, I will put it into the chat box, the link to the report. And they've also got, a website that's got all the different types of facilities, when they can open. I'll tell you on the social distancing front, I think the problems that you're going to encounter are problems that are happening across the board already with restaurants. I don't see the city. The governor had mentioned in the beginning that the way that these rules were going to be enforced was through local jurisdictions had the power. And in the beginning, his executive order said jail time or fine. And then you probably saw, if you watched the news at all, there was an issue with a woman in Dallas opening up her hair salon. She was actually held in contempt of court. It wasn't in violation. I think it was more in contempt of court. But then Abbott went back and took jail time out of his order. he's also said that the way that this can be enforced is through license. So you could lose your license if you're not abiding by the rules. But I think there's also a question of what's in the executive order and what is a guideline. So social distancing, for example, masks are not required, they're recommended. So if people aren't wearing masks, that's not something in the order, it's just a recommendation. So there's also a distinction between recommendations and what's being required. But I think what you're seeing is because of what happened with the Dallas issue, you're going to see cities and counties not, I don't see there being a strong enforcement. That is not something to hang your hat on. That's just to say these issues are going to be across more than just the arts community. And so far, nobody has really successfully navigated how to enforce these rules. Let me see if I can push a link up onto the chat box.
Thank you,
Thanks
Shannon.
for your answer.
Yes, thank you for that, Shannon. The other question I see right here, just clarifying, restaurants are allowed to reopen at 50% capacity starting this week. Is that correct?
Yes, except for in, I think, the counties that I mentioned.
Yeah, El Paso, yeah.
And yes.
I was going to say one thing real quickly about liability. I'm sure that you are all on all kinds of Zoom chats now, maybe within your industry, with colleagues, maybe outside, across the state or across the country. But liability is coming up more and more as a real issue. And I think that Shannon mentioned the fact that we're not there yet, but that the governor is aware of a need to do some level of policy protection against that. I've done quite a bit of work on this concern and several others with attorneys around liability, and the attorneys themselves. I mean, they're very often I'll go to a source and say, black or white, what is the right answer here? And they themselves don't know. And so I feel like a lot of what we're feeling within the arts, I think most of us want to do the right thing. We definitely want to keep our businesses afloat, but we also want to do it in an ethical and decent way. And there's just not one size fits all. Everyone can feel like there's going to be that moment where you got to weigh all your best information and then take a stand, and then what? So almost every conversation that I've been on in the last 2 weeks has gotten around very quickly to liability. So I'm not surprised that came up today. We may need you on that issue. So if something happens, you may say, all right, let's all please support this. If we need to raise these voices around the need for small businesses, in this case, arts organizations, to have some level of protection if we in fact are being told to open or that we may open. So, other questions that we have?
And I just put a link in the chat box for the Open Texas. And if you go on that link, every type of facility has a checklist. So you can click on it, and there's a little bit greater guidelines or guidance for each type of facility. And I saw a question in the chat box. Yes, 50%. Restaurants are allowed to open at 50% now.
And go ahead. I see you have your hand.
Right.
Yes. So also, I just posed a link from the Event Safety Alliance, and yesterday the American Association of Performing Arts Professionals, APAP, did a webinar, and one of the sort of guidelines that's rising to the top in the Performing Arts Center world is the ESA report. So you can take a look at that. It's a crowdsourced document that was drafted by performing arts organizations, and I've seen it coming up. There's a question here about performing arts. The theaters are one of the most complicated entities, and even though movie theaters were opened as part of phase one, theaters or art theaters, whatever you want to call them, have not been included in that. And that's probably going to be one of the last things that does open.